Are you a good person? Oh, what am I saying? Of course you are. Everyone is a good person. That is, after all, what they tell themselves. You are enlightened, or perhaps virtuous. Just look at how hard you work, and all that you give. Isn't that right? Surely no one could argue these points. Surely you must be a blameless, lily-white angel. Surely you've never hurt anyone. At least, not anyone that didn't deserve it. Have you? If so, yours is an enviable position. Everyone hurts someone, somewhere, at some time. We all step on toes as we make our way. This is why everyone has enemies. Except for you, of course, you lucky fool. Alas, our little friend Elizabeth Hartley was not quite so fortunate. The pretty, by mouse standards, little woman, clad in her little red cloak, cringed in the shadow of a large stone, as the sound of metal tearing rent the air. Monster, a scarred, hairless giant of a mouse, clutched his bleeding hand, grinding his teeth to hold in a howl of pain. Trailing from his shoulders was a deep green cape, the color of the eyes of a lost love. Stu the Shrew huddled in Elizabeth's shadow, a pair of spectacles balanced precariously on the tip of his lightly mustachioed snout. "The good news is, I think we've lost it," Peter Dane, a brilliant former lab rat in a tweed jacket, announced as he peered around the side of the stone. "The bad news is, I believe we've lost the scale as well." Elizabeth crept to Peter's side to see the carnage for herself. Stu would have protested, but he didn't dare raise his voice. It was when Monster moved to join the others that the little shrew finally gave in and crept up alongside them. Beyond the stone stood what had once been the scale, a sailing vehicle fashioned from a discarded roller skate. Its mast had been snapped clean off, the silk sails spun by Peter's friend and companion, Matrix, having been torn to shreds. The strange, multi-limbed beast responsible had then proceeded to gnaw at the front axle. There was a loud crash as it split in two, causing the wheels on either side to simply tip over, and leaving the front end of the scale to drop to the ground. The beast scurried backward, hissing at the scale, and then rushed forward to attack the main platform. "What is that thing?" Stu whispered. "Shalifujay," Peter answered. "What jay?"
"A wind scorpion,"
Elizabeth explained.
"or a sun spider, or camel spider if you prefer."
Stu glanced back to the creature. "I don't see no humps on that thing." "Poisonous?" Monster asked, fingering his wound. "Less poisonous than Matrix," Peter answered. "Uh-huh," the spider on Peter's shoulder agreed. "They prefer to rip their prey to pieces," Peter added. Another groan of metal shearing apart punctuated his remark. "Can we outrun it?" Stu asked. Elizabeth shook her head.
"They're too fast."
"Fast enough to catch the scale in motion, yes," Peter agreed. "So we can't fight it, can't run from it," Stu muttered. "Great, what do we do now?" "Throw at the shrew and run while it's distracted," Monster suggested. He was met with 4 disgusted glares from the others. Monster simply shrugged. "It was only a thought." A light flickered on in Peter's eye. "A shrew, yes!" "No!" Stu exclaimed. "Y'all ain't throwing me to that thing!" "Of course not, no! You could dig us a tunnel to safety!" "Uh-oh!" Matrix squeaked and pointed upward. A heavy silence fell across the friends as they perked up their ears and listened. The sounds of metal groaning and tearing had stopped. A slender strand of saliva dripped from overhead, splattering across the top of Stu's head. The shrew cringed in disgust. "I just put my foot in it, didn't I?" Twin pincer-like jaws spread open overhead as the sun spider shrieked.
"Everyone, scatter!"
Elizabeth shouted, diving to the side. When the sun spider struck the ground, its gargantuan jaws bit only into sand. Its head twisted about, shaking the dust from its jaws, legs churning the dust as it spun. The beast's tiny black eyes immediately zeroed in on the smallest, most vulnerable of its prey, Stu the Shrew. Stu, for his part, furiously clawed at the ground, digging his way into a shallow hole. The sun spider, however, was too quick to escape into the ground. It darted forward, jaws wide and ready to saw their way into shrew flesh. Monster rushed the solifuge from the side, ramming his shoulder between its mid-right limbs, and heaved his arms under the beast's chest. A multitude of legs scratched and skittered for a hold as its entire body lifted into the air, propelled upwards by the giant howling mouse. The sun spider screeched as its eyes were thrust into the dusty ground, limbs thrashing at the air as Monster flipped the beast onto its back. "Your halberd, sir!" Peter shouted, heaving on the weapon's shaft as he struggled to drag it back to the stone. "Quick, while the creature is vulnerable!" Monster scooped up Stu as he darted past, the late afternoon sun beating down on them as he rushed to meet Peter. In his absence, the sun spider gave a great heave of its forelimbs, its segmented body curling more like a millipede than a spider as it fought to right itself. As Monster returned, armed, the unusual creature came crashing back down on its stomach, shaking the dust from its eyes and hissing furiously. "Everyone, take cover!" Monster roared. Despite their loyalty and concern for him, the others obeyed. Of the 5, Monster had the most experience combating large arachnid predators, but this was something quite outside his experience. As the two clashed, the lightning-quick beast caught the head of Monster's halberd in its jaws and hung on with a grip that would have put a tick to shame. The two wrestled for a time, each combatant tugging in opposite directions as they circled. Monster rushed up along the side of the boulder, using his momentum to wrench the solifuge's head to the side. Though it staggered, it kept its footing and managed to twist its neck in the opposite direction. The halberd's shaft whipped the way Monster had come, flinging him onto his back. "Someone, do something!" Monster roared, as the sun spider wrenched its head in the other direction, smashing him against the side of the rock, and then back again. As the beast twisted its head aside a third time, the weapon's shaft slipped from Monster's fingers, and the force of the sun spider's motion sent it spinning away to clatter against the stone and tumble to the ground. Then the solifuge broke into a full charge, and anyone who has observed a solifuge at full charge will certainly attest it is a sight to behold, jaws open and ready to saw the hapless mouse in two, but it never reached its victim. A circle of chain links sailed across the sky, snapping tight across the sun spider's jaws and yanking painfully backwards. The beast shrieked and reared as the chain wedged itself firmly into the joints at the base of its jaws, too far back for it to bite through the steel lasso. A lone mouse stood atop the stone, the chain wrapped around one hand while he controlled its motions with the others. His features were obscured beneath a cowboy hat pulled low over his brow, and the brilliant light of the sun as it dipped towards the horizon, casting his form in shadow. Elizabeth gasped as she watched the newcomer's sure, confident motions, those of a man who had done this kind of thing many times before.
"It can't be,"
she breathed.
"But it has to be. It is!"
The mouse leapt down from his perch, landing on the solifuge's back and pressing a foot against its head as he heaved backwards. The sun spider fought, of course, leaping about and staggering this way and that as it attempted to throw off its uninvited rider, yet he mirrored and countered every motion. Monster scampered out from underfoot as the crazed beast stomped and skittered this way and that. Had he remained, it would have trampled Monster underfoot. The sun spider lurched to the left as its rider pulled the chain aside, sending it skittering in a mad circle one way and then the other. It reared as the rider pulled back, then spun about to the side. Elizabeth and her companions watched in sheer amazement as the savage beast slowly buckled under the force of its rider's will, eventually crawling about almost peacefully as its spirit gave out against the strength of the chain. When at last the solifuge slowed to a halt, its rider dismounted, and fanning his sweaty, dusty face with his broad hat, he looked the other mice, and rat, and shrew, and spider, up and down. Elizabeth darted out from under the cover of a dry, prickly bush, eagerly scampering up to greet her rescuer. By the way he moved, the speed, agility, and confidence, she was sure it had to be... But as she drew closer and started to observe the mouse's features, it became clear he was not her beloved Don Copper, after all the time and tears she had spent in search of him. Elizabeth couldn't help it. Her expression visibly fell. The mouse smirked as he shot Elizabeth a squinting glance. "You're welcome, hon." He wiped the dust from his eyes as he donned his hat. He wore a little brown vest, a pair of holstered six-shooters hanging from his belt. He appeared a fair bit older than Don had been, his skin weathered and fur bleached a pale gray by the sun. Elizabeth blushed, her mouth tugging into a bashful smile.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, of course. That was amazing.
"Really?" The mouse glanced back at the tamed sun spider. "Thought I was a bit sloppy. I was a mite embarrassed, to be honest." He pulled the leather glove from his right hand, rubbed it against his chest, and extended it towards Elizabeth. "My name's Saul Morgan." Elizabeth accepted Saul's hand and began to introduce herself.
Elizabeth...
"Yeah, Liz Hartley. Thought I knew your face." Elizabeth blinked and gave Saul a coy half-smile.
Have we met?
"Nope," Saul answered. "You're famous around these parts. Did you really kill a rattlesnake?" Elizabeth visibly paled as her stomach sank and tied itself into knots.
Yes, actually.
"Dove down its throat and stabbed it through the roof of the mouth." Elizabeth nodded, her face taking on the faintest shade of green as she remembered. Saul just grinned. "You got guts." "I'm all right, thank you for asking," Monster growled as he rubbed his aching arms. Elizabeth, who had quite forgotten about him, blushed as she remembered her friend's struggle.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Are you...
Saul chuckled. "You just said it was all right." Monster grumbled irritably. "Thank you for asking." "Wowee!" Stu exclaimed, emerging from the same hiding place as Elizabeth. "Unbelievable show! Is that who I think it is?" "I doubt it," Saul answered. "But I'm guessing you're who I think you are. Stu the Shrew, right? And you're Peter Dane in Matrix, right?" Peter nodded as he brushed a branch aside, accompanied by a quick "aha" from the spider on his shoulder. "Which would make you... Monster?" Monster grunted, looking past Saul to Elizabeth. "It would seem your fame has rubbed off on us." "I'm curious, Mr. Morden," Peter remarked. "Exactly who is it we're famous among? You're the first soul we've come across in several days." "There's a town just north of here," Saul explained. "It's a ways away from the road, but easy enough to find." Monster raised an eyebrow. "By town, do you mean?" "It's a mouse town," Saul clarified. "Well, mouse and company anyway. I pass through every so often to find jobs."
What sort of jobs?
Elizabeth asked. Despite her polite, even sweet facade, she had seen enough treacherous smiles to be suspicious of nearly anyone. Saul tucked his thumbs into his pockets and glanced self-consciously at the sky. "Right. Well, there's no fooling smart folk like you. I'm a bounty hunter. Just got back from a good haul, and I'm looking to blow the reward. Any of you fine people care to join me?" He looked directly at Elizabeth as he spoke. Elizabeth cast an uneasy look Peter and Monster's way and shrugged.
You plan to spend it all at once? That doesn't seem wise.
"Yeah, I can see how you'd think that. Well, my clients pay well, and I'm used to scavenging. Money isn't really a big deal for me." Elizabeth raised a curious eyebrow.
Then why pursue it?
Saul grinned. "Same reason I wrangle sun spiders. For the thrill." Saul threw an arm across Elizabeth's shoulders and leaned close. She eagerly wriggled out from under his hold. Undeterred, Saul went on. "Look, I saw your scale. It needs work, and you good folk look mighty tired. I can get you all rooms and dinner for the night, and we'll take it from there in the morning. What do you say?"
I say that's remarkably generous.
Elizabeth answered.
What's the catch?
"You are," Saul retorted.
beautiful, courageous lady. I'll bet you've got a ton of stories to tell.
Thank you. I'm very flattered, but I'm afraid my heart is spoken for.
Saul chuckled.
Honey, I'm not asking you to marry me. Just spend an evening with me.
Saul paused, his face suddenly turning the color of a ripe apple.
Well, what I mean is, I don't want your heart, I just want your company. Okay?
Elizabeth looked to her friends for approval. Monster and Stu glanced at each other and then looked to Peter. Peter nodded.
The scale does need repairs, assuming it can be repaired. A roof over our heads and dinner on our plates would be most welcome.
Well then, that settles it,
Saul concluded.
It does settle it, right?
Elizabeth nodded. Saul tipped his hat to her and clambered onto the sun spider's back.
Say, missy, you ever ride a spider before?
Elizabeth shook her head.
Want to? It'll make the trip mighty easier.
Elizabeth eyed the animal for a time. It shook its head, rattling its chain, and stomped into the dust, wheezing and hissing. At last Elizabeth shook her head.
No, I don't think so. It looks like it still has some fight left.
Saul shrugged.
Shoot yourself. Me, I'm done walking today.
Elizabeth motioned to her friends to gather. While Monster and Stu came to her side, Peter cast a rueful glance to the scale.
Go on, Bess, he called back. I'll catch up with you.
Do you need any help?
Monster asked. Peter glanced back to the scale and shook his head.
No, I believe it should be lighter in parts than altogether.
Why don't you pull it together and hitch it up to my boy here?
Saul suggested.
Let the spider do the work for you.
Peter eyed the solifuge, and then the scraps of metal, as he hesitantly pictured the task in his head. At last he nodded.
If you insist, good sir.
Good sir insists,
Saul called back, imitating Peter's tone and accent. With some help from Monster, it proved to be a short job, albeit a discouraging one. Matrix lashed the fragments of the scale together with a generously thick net of silk, and then fastened 2 additional ropes to the sun spider's harness. The much larger arachnid growled irritably as it felt the weight holding it down, sending Matrix scurrying back to Peter's shoulder. At last, Saul dug his heels into the beast's sides, spurring it into motion. Normally a speedy animal, the solifuge had to struggle against its new load, forcing it to proceed considerably slower. Elizabeth and company were able to follow on foot at a comfortable pace, without falling too far behind Saul. The land around them was rugged and beautiful. It was large, far larger than anything Elizabeth had previously dreamed of. The air was dry, and the ground dusty and hard. There wasn't much in the way of plants or vegetation, small prickly bushes, a few bright thorny flowers, and the occasional titanic cactus. Beneath the endless red sky, it all appeared to go on forever. Stu, despite all the adventures he had been on with Elizabeth, was not known for his endurance, and given time he began to lag behind. Monster came up behind the little shrew, and heaving him off the ground, tucked him under one arm.
Mr. Morden,
Elizabeth called to the rider, having noticed Stu's difficulty.
Is it much farther?
Nope,
came the answer.
Should be just over this next hill.
Elizabeth silently doubted him. Saul, after all, was riding rather than walking. Yet as she crested the hill alongside him, she saw that it was true. In a shallow gully beneath the hill's shadow, she saw it spread out, a network of interconnected, rodent-sized buildings, each of them linked with various rope bridges, ladders, and walkways. It was quite unlike anything she had seen before.
Nice, huh?
Saul remarked, taking in Elizabeth's expression. Elizabeth nodded.
Beautiful, in its way.
Till you get too close,
Saul answered.
Kind of like a poisonous flower.
Does it have a name?
Elizabeth asked. Saul shrugged.
I just call it home.
A great many eyes followed them as they strode into the main street. Elizabeth noted, however, that the focus did not appear to be on Saul's formidable mount. Rather, as she met the many gazes, she found them staring directly at her. Many teeth chewed many cigars, many fingers scratched foreheads and adjusted an array of hats perched on a myriad of heads. There were mice, of course, and a number of rats. A low croak signaled the presence of a small toad. A couple of prairie dogs leaned over a rail overhead, raising curious eyebrows as Elizabeth's crew passed beneath their perch. A small crowd gathered at the edges of the street to watch as Peter severed the cords hitching the pile of scrap to Saul's sun spider. There was a loud crash as a brawny mole hurled a tiny mouse-like figure with freakishly large feet out a nearby door with a shout of, "Come back when you have money to pay!" "Ah, your mother eats earthworms," the little fellow slurred back. Standing up, he dusted himself off, set his mini cowboy hat back on his head, and tucking his thumbs in his pockets, looked around. His eager gaze immediately settled on Saul, and the little man put those feet to their intended use as he hopped after the bounty hunter, not unlike a shrew-sized kangaroo. Elizabeth recognized the motions and the features almost immediately.
A kangaroo rat?
She glanced to Stu.
I've read about them in my books, but I've never seen one in person.
Would you give one a few coins for a drink?
The kangaroo rat suddenly appeared at Elizabeth's side, letting out a long breath that smelled like the inner workings of a leaky brewery. Elizabeth covered her nose and shook her head.
I'm afraid I don't have any money.
The kangaroo rat's face fell, and he set off after Saul.
Hey, Morton, my good and dear friend. Help a fella out, friend?
Saul pulled the solifuge to an abrupt halt. It swung its massive head about and let out a furious hiss in the kangaroo rat's direction, sending him hopping backwards in fright.
Whoa there! Nice horsey! Good boy!
The kangaroo rat stumbled over his own feet, falling with a loud thud on his rump. Saul stood up and leaned over the side of his mount, pushing his hat back a bit with one thumb.
Good to see you too, Ralph. How deep are you in this time?
Deep enough to get tossed out on my ear.
Saul grinned and tossed down a small pouch, which rattled as it hit the ground.
Buy the boys around on me.
Ralph, the kangaroo rat, gasped with relief as he gathered up the pouch and bowed furiously as he backed away.
You, sir, are a gentleman in a den of thieves.
Saul's first stop was a local stable. As Elizabeth peered in, she saw stalls filled with any number of large predators that might have made an easy meal of the locals. A tarantula gazed, unblinking, out from behind a gate, while a centipede coiled and writhed in the pen next to it. There was a low clicking and crunching nearby, and a thick, muscular tail rose from another stall, but Elizabeth couldn't quite make out what it was attached to. The hostler was every bit as impressive as his charges, a large, one-eyed prairie dog, chewing constantly, who occasionally spat in a nearby bucket with the precision of a master marksman. A single growl from him was enough to freeze Saul's latest conquest in its tracks. Turning his eye to Saul, the hostler spoke up in a rasping snarl.
How much?
Saul patted the solifuge on the side of its back.
This one's not for sale. I just want a place to feed and water him.
You sure? The boys out on East Hill would pay good for one of these things.
Saul grinned.
Quite sure. I've got plans for this beastie.
The hostler glanced past Saul to Elizabeth and grunted.
$20 a night.
He wasn't very friendly,
Elizabeth remarked as Saul rejoined the others. Saul shrugged.
You saw what he keeps back there? The guy can't afford to show any weakness. I guess he just got in the habit, you know. Anyway,
Saul slapped his palms together, eagerly changing the subject.
You folks must be hungry way out here.
There was a loud growl at the mention of hunger. All eyes turned to Elizabeth.
Excuse me,
she squeaked, blushing. Saul laughed and poked Elizabeth's stomach.
That must be the famous Hartley appetite talking. This should be fun to see.
Spoken like someone who's never seen it, Peter muttered to Matrix. The spider answered with a light giggle. Monster was silent as Saul led off. He trailed behind the rest of the group, poking at the ground with the end of his halberd. With a snarl, he sent an overly curious gopher scurrying for cover. Monster flashed a smirk at the fleeing rodent's back. He found the little fellow's fear to be reassuring. Saul led up a handful of ladders to a large wooden structure, sandwiched in among many other buildings of the same sort. A very familiar sign was set out front.
Yip and Yaps,
Stu read. He scowled.
Those two again?
The Ferret brothers from Fairville had apparently abandoned their old trading post in favor of a rodent-sized diner. As Elizabeth entered, she was greeted with the sound of grease sizzling and a potent cocktail of delicious smells.
They can cook,
Stu exclaimed. Everyone has some talent or other, Peter remarked. Even rascals like Yip and Yap. A rotund, dignified-looking mouse dressed in a black silk jacket and bow tie approached the group and bowed.
Good evening,
he greeted.
I'm Alfred, and tonight I'll be your waiter. Please walk this way.
Check your food when he serves it,
Saul muttered to Elizabeth.
Al likes to slip little extras to his customers.
When they were seated, Elizabeth couldn't help noticing every eye in the diner looking her way. She squirmed uncomfortably in her chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. Monster twisted about on his stool, gave his halberd a good shake, and snarled softly. There were some scattered, faint murmurs in response, but little reaction.
Let me guess,
Stu piped up.
Y'all don't get a lot of women round here, right?
Saul smirked.
Plenty of women, son. But Miss Hartley isn't just any woman. She's a bit of a local legend. It's mighty exciting for us drifters.
Glancing back to Elizabeth, he raised a curious eyebrow.
Did you really eat out an entire great ape larder?
Elizabeth smiled sheepishly.
It was actually just a few blocks of cheese.
Peter cringed, cupping his eyes into a hand and shaking his head.
By a few blocks, Saul asked, are we talking a mouse-sized serving or...
A great ape-sized package, Peter blurted out. Several great ape-sized packages. Saul peered over the side of the table at Elizabeth's stomach.
I managed to work it off,
Elizabeth clarified.
Anyway, that was almost a year ago.
Saul mumbled.
I bet that was a sight to see.
It wasn't really,
Elizabeth insisted.
I was just cold and afraid and hungry, and it smelled like home and...
Elizabeth immediately became aware of a sudden silence in the room, as every ear perked up to listen in on her story. She blushed and fell quiet. There was a low, heavy thud as a large, fat rat slid off his bar stool nearby. He stroked his thick, bushy mustache as he looked Elizabeth up and down. Then he scoffed and sauntered over to her table. He was dressed in a sleeveless snakeskin jacket and wore a frayed straw hat.
I hear you have big appetite, little girlie,
the rat grumbled.
Is that what you hear?
Elizabeth gulped, looking up at the rat's cold, calculating eyes.
Well, I've been working on it, getting it under control.
The rat scoffed.
Well, you don't have big appetite as Big Andre.
Elizabeth blinked.
Excuse me?
Me, I am Big Andre.
Ah.
Elizabeth muttered, taken aback.
Well, it's very nice to meet you, Mr. Big. Or is it Mr. Andre?
Not Mr. Big, little girlie. I am Big Andre.
Elizabeth glanced to Saul for clarification.
He's challenging you,
Saul explained.
Ah,
Big Andre agreed.
They say little girlie eats big food. I say Big Andre eats bigger food.
Saul chuckled.
I once saw him eat 20 pies, 7 blocks of cheese, a cactus, and 30 sandwiches, and was not even hungry.
Elizabeth noted the way the rat's white undershirt rode up on his protruding belly.
I don't doubt it.
Eh?
The rat glanced down at Saul for a moment. Saul wore a similar look of confusion.
Maybe I don't be clear. Big Andre challenges little girlie to eat off. Little girlie out-eats Big Andre. Big Andre pays tab.
And if I lose?
Elizabeth asked.
And if Big Andre trailed off? Then I cover you both,
Saul piped up.
What Hunter says,
Big Andre agreed. Elizabeth shook her head.
Sorry, not interested.
Her stomach, however, growled in protest.
Little girlie's mouth say no, but her stomach say yes.
Mr. Big.
Elizabeth began.
Sorry, Mr. Big. It took me a long time to lose that weight, and I was very slow and at risk until then. So if it's all the same to you, let's agree that you have the bigger appetite and leave it at that.
A low growl drew Big Andre's attention to Monster.
I, for one, agree. Perhaps once we were here long enough to know the town is safe. Until that, it's best for her to remain light on her feet.
Yeah, come on,
The familiar voice of Yap piped up from behind the bar.
I give you 10 to 1 odds. If you win big.
An incredulous grin crossed Elizabeth's face, and she heaved a short giggle in disbelief.
This is ridiculous. I don't have anything to prove. Not to you, not to myself. And even if I did, why does it matter who can eat more?
Oh, please,
Yap whined, darting over with a fresh-baked pie.
give us a show. Just smell that. Oh, you can eat just like that.
The ferret eagerly waved the pastry under Elizabeth's nose, while a round of applause went up. Elizabeth leaned back in her seat, as far from the delicious smell as she could get, while her stomach roared a desperate plea.
Mr. Yap, please, don't make me hungry. You wouldn't like me when I'm hungry.
I like anyone that runs up a good bill,
Yap retorted.
But only if they pays it.
Yip's voice barked from the kitchen. Peter shot Saul a suspicious look. Heaving a sigh, the rat rose to his feet and set a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. Come with me, Bez. Let's let the boys cool off a bit.
Hey, wait a minute.
Saul began to protest. Monster cut him off with a low growl as he hopped to his feet. Outside, on a balcony overlooking the street far below, Elizabeth heaved a sigh of relief.
Thank you, Peter. I was just about to give in.
Peter leaned on the railing at the balcony's edge. Matrix, growing dizzy with vertigo, scuttled down Peter's back, holding his head with a light whine.
Ugh.
It hasn't been this bad since Fairville,
Elizabeth added. Peter mumbled. Tell me, Bess, do you think you could out-eat that fellow? Elizabeth snorted out an awkward giggle.
In a heartbeat. Why?
Peter looked out over the street, gazing across to the other side. I'm going to need a few extra parts to repair the scale, and that will take money. I have a little set aside. A tenfold return would be extremely helpful. Pausing a moment, he added, and I don't think it wise to let Mr. Morden cover any of our expenses. I'd rather not be indebted to him, if you follow my reasoning. Elizabeth stared at Peter in disbelief.
Didn't you take me out here to get away from the pressure?
Peter nodded. I did. It was just a thought. Elizabeth rolled her eyes to the sky, sighing in annoyance.
You know, this is how you lost your home.
Indeed.
Can I be alone for a while?
At the suggestion, Peter's expression turned grim. I don't think that would be wise either. Not in this town. I believe our friend, Mr. Morden, may be up to something. Elizabeth took a deep breath, gazing into the ruddy stone further down the gully. Looking up at Peter, she concluded,
Let's flip a coin.
Back in the diner, if it could have been called that, a round of applause went up as the third dart struck a bullseye. Stu gaped, and Monster raised an eyebrow as they watched Saul stride to the board to collect his darts. Their eager audience exchanged bills and coins as Monster stepped up for his turn at the board. Yap eagerly wrote down Saul's revised score.
Looks like Lisbeth's not the only celebrity around here,
Stu remarked to the rat next to him.
Da, Morden is the cracked shot.
Monster took a more conservative aim, nailing 3 20s. A round of "Boo!" answered him. Monster grumbled as he retrieved his darts and resumed watching Saul's form as he stepped up for another turn. Each dart seemed to land just where he wanted, as if he were standing next to the board rather than across the room. Yet there were no cheers this time. Saul glanced about curiously and noticed everyone was staring at the door.
Mr. Andre?
"Big Andre!" everyone shouted back. Elizabeth cracked a sly half-smile, the light shining in around her outline.
I accept your challenge.
Listen up, folks.
Yip announced, drawing a white chalk line down the middle of a table.
There's no time limit, no food limit. Well, except what we got on hand. When you empty a plate, set it aside on your side of the table. That's how we'll keep score. If you throw up, you forfeit. Any questions?
Can I having 1 fry on plate?
Yip blinked, and his expression shifted into an unpleasant scowl.
What, and waste a good plate? No, we're piling them to the ceiling.
Place your bets right here.
Yap chimed in, taking up a position behind the counter.
10 to 1 against Liz Hartley. Tell all your friends.
We start in an hour,
Yip added.
It'll take me that long to cook the first round.
That's also how long it took to place the first round of bets. There was a line up and down the walkway outside, down a ladder, and then up and down the walkway below. In the commotion, Saul slipped away for a little side business, but every ladder seemed to be choked with the eager audience, so he could only wait as the locals filed past, cash in hand. Eventually, he managed to squeeze into a seedy little saloon at the side of the street. Back in the diner, Monster shook his head and rubbed his temples.
This is madness.
This is what we do on Saturday nights.
Monster looked down to his left. There was a pretty little mouse standing there, dressed in a black trench coat. Her light blonde hair was cut in an uneven mop, her green eyes sparkling merrily as she smiled up at Monster. He couldn't fight the feeling he had seen her somewhere before.
You stuff yourselves silly.
We bet on whatever contest we can find,
she answered. The mouse grinned.
Hello, Monster.
Monster raised a curious eyebrow.
Do I know you?
The mouse stroked Monster's hand.
How's my cloak been treating you?
Astrid?
Yap tucked 2 fingers between his teeth and brought a heavy silence over the room with a sharp whistle.
Places, everyone.
Elizabeth and Big Andre sat down on opposite sides of the table. The rat grinned down at his opponent.
Hey, little girlie, me best man winning.
Elizabeth gave a short giggle.
Don't you mean best person? Or best eater? Or best man or woman?
Big Andre heaved a throaty guffaw.
Niet, best man.
At the door to the kitchen, Yip caught Alfred by his collar.
Now listen, pal, you spike anyone's meals and you'll never work in this town again. Capiche?
Alfred gave Yip a practiced look of indifference.
Of course.
As Alfred brought out the first plates, Elizabeth glanced to Yap.
Is there any silverware? You know, a fork and knife?
Yap scratched his head.
Silverware?
Bah! Big Andre laughed.
Big Andre does not need.
At that, he simply tipped his plate back and let the food just slide into his mouth.
There,
he mumbled, slobbering as he talked and chewed.
Next food.
Alfred produced a bundle wrapped in a napkin from his breast pocket and set it beside Elizabeth's plate.
For you, madam. More food!
Big Andre shouted, bringing his fist down on the table. The force abruptly tipped the table in his direction, catapulting Elizabeth's plate into Big Andre's face and splattering his muzzle with its contents. The rat was silent for a moment, glancing about the diner with a look of intense mortification.
Pardon, Big Andre, little girlie.
Elizabeth grinned, red-faced, clutching her bundle of silverware.
Don't mention it.
Alfred brought out a pair of bowls next, setting them at opposite sides of the table.
Ah, Big Andre sighed. Just what I be needing.
He promptly dunked his entire face in the bowl, swishing it around to wash off his muscle, and then downed the contents in one gulp, and wiped his mouth off on his arm.
It's very good.
Elizabeth, by contrast, was dainty and polite. She raised a spoonful of soup to her lips, blew lightly to cool it, and then took a sip. It was simply wonderful, warming her throat and heart as she swallowed. Elizabeth's eyes crossed, her mouth curled into a moronic grin, and she was off. Dainty, ladylike, but incredibly quick. A moment later, she was dabbing her lips with her napkin, and set her spoon neatly alongside her knife and fork.
Bah, enough of stallings! More food!
Alfred brought out several trays of pastries next. As Big Andre manically stuffed his face, Elizabeth nibbled on a jelly donut.
Ha! The rat laughed. You are looking that fast. Is little girlie feeling full?
Just warming up.
Elizabeth answered.
Besides, one shouldn't eat too much, too fast. You should try pacing yourself, Mr. Andre. Haven't you heard the story of the tortoise and the hare?
Big Andre ate tortoise for breakfast because he was too not fast, just like little girlie.
When Alfred brought out a pair of sub-sandwiches, Big Andre greedily seized his and stuffed the whole thing in his mouth, waiter and all. He stopped chewing when he felt something struggling in his bulging cheeks. Reaching an entire hand in, he yanked out the disheveled waiter and set him on the floor.
Sorry, Mr. Man of Culture. Now bring Big Andre bigger food.
So it went on into the night. Many times Elizabeth rolled her eyes at Big Andre's atrocious table manners. Many times Big Andre laughed and taunted her as his empty dishes piled up. And many times did those unfortunate onlookers who bet on Elizabeth wipe their sweaty brows as she lagged behind. At last the rat leaned back, looking with pride on his wall of dishes.
Big Andre is full. Signs autographs later. Maybe let little girlie kiss hand of champion.
As she looked at the hand in question, Elizabeth nearly lost her appetite. Flashing a wry grin, she retorted,
I think I'll pass, Mr. Champion.
At this point, her score numbered a stack of 4 plates and a bowl, and she was just now moving on to her first sandwich. Yip rolled his eyes.
Okay, folks, I think we know our winner.
Wait, Peter piped up. You did say there was no time limit.
Well, just look,
Yip grumbled. Yet as he said it, he saw that Elizabeth's stack of plates had grown from 4 to 8 in the time he looked away.
Like I said,
Elizabeth wiped her lips.
I'm just warming up.
Yip's eyes bulged as he watched Elizabeth very neatly, very daintily, inhale a plate's contents and move on to another. Scattered cheers brought Big Andre out of his stupor. He sat up at the sound of loud, angry buzzing, not unlike a chainsaw. His mouth dropped open in amazement as spotless plates rapidly piled up on an equally spotless half of the table.
More foods!
Big Andre stammered in a panic.
Yes.
Elizabeth agreed, leaning back and patting her bulging stomach.
What he said.
Before long, Alfred resumed ferrying out tray after tray. Big Andre put on a titanic effort, greedily stuffing his face as quickly as he could manage. But as he had said, he was full. He quickly began to slow, eventually falling back listlessly in his chair, a half-eaten sandwich hanging out the side of his mouth like a cigar stuffed with cheese and lettuce. Elizabeth forged full steam ahead, halting only to scrape her plates clean, breathe, and take a drink of water.
Make room for me, Mr. Schwartz, the rat cried out. Big Andre is ready!
Her side of the table cleaned out, Elizabeth then looked up and asked,
Are you going to finish that? It'd be a shame to let good food go to waste.
Big Andre's stomach gave a sickening gurgle of surrender. The rat covered his mouth with one hand, his face turning the faintest shade of green as his eyes rolled back.
I take that as a no,
Elizabeth answered, and she reached across the table for a fresh plate. Her fork spun like a little windmill, flinging neatly cut bits of food into her mouth. Then she moved on to another plate, and another.
Some person, I am begging, make it not go!
Big Andre wailed, holding his head as the room began to spin around him.
Big Andre can't take any more! He gives! Father's brother person!
Uncle. Peter sauntered to Elizabeth's side, a rather smug grin on his face. Well now, I believe you've beaten him, Bess. You can stop now. Elizabeth paused just a moment to look up at Peter, eyes wide in terror.
That's the problem. I don't think I can. Too much momentum. Have to keep going.
Peter grimaced as he looked over Big Andre's side of the table. I see. Astrid looked up at Monster, her mouth agape in a look of horror.
I knew she had an appetite, but this is ridiculous.
This is Saturday night,
Monster grunted. At long last, Elizabeth finally leaned back in her chair, squeezing her eyes shut as she cringed.
This was a mistake.
She held her belly in both hands. It looked like an overinflated beach ball.
I think I'm going to be sick.
No! Shouted a panicked voice from amid the crowd. Don't get sick! Whatever you do, we have money on you! At once, a pair of chipmunks rushed forward. One fanned Elizabeth while the other massaged her feet. In the commotion, Saul slunk over to Big Andre's side and discreetly slipped the rat an envelope of large bills. A moment later, he appeared beside Stu, furiously applauding. The little shrew clapped, but his eyes drifted up to the strange mouse beside him. He spotted a folded, tattered sheet of paper tucked into Saul's breast pocket, and could just barely make out the very edge of a detailed sketch inside. Now, Peter announced, leading a small crowd over to the counter, I believe you have something that belongs to us. As if to emphasize the point, a gopher beside him flipped open a switchblade. Yap gulped. Bro!
Leave this to me, bro,
Yip growled, emerging from the kitchen. He fixed the gopher with a harsh glare and flared his nostrils. The blade immediately fell limp, and the gopher grinned sheepishly.
Now then,
Yip went on,
let nobody say Yip and Yap don't pay their debts. Thing is, we're expecting a bit of money ourselves, if our challenger is up to paying his debt.
All eyes turned to Big Andre's side of the table. The rat was hidden behind the piles of plates, but his hand could be seen waving a little white flag. Yip walked over to Big Andre's side and gave the rat a sharp rap on the stomach. He was answered with a yellowish geyser of projectile vomit.
That's disgusting,
the ferret grumbled, face dripping.
Hey, Jumbo, don't you owe us a little something, for all the chow?
Big Andre let out a groan. Yip turned around with a scowl to face his eager debt-ease.
That settles it, folks. Ye ain't coughing up nothing tonight.
It looks like he already did, a mole shouted from the back of the group.
Well, ha,
Yip snapped.
That's so funny, I almost died laughing. Thing is, no one gets paid until tomorrow. Come back in the morning when Andre's had some time to sleep it off. Big Andre,
the rat corrected. There arose a chorus of protests from the night's winners. Elizabeth held her head, which felt as if the noise might make it explode. It was Peter who finally stopped the commotion.
I agree, he shouted over the noise. There's nothing to do with our money tonight regardless, and I expect our hosts will honor their agreements.
Yeah,
Yap agreed. We're honorable. Because they know what would happen if they left town before doing so, Peter added.
Yip scowled at Peter, but couldn't argue the point.
Yeah, we know what you people are capable of. Now scram!
Peter gave Yip a long look. Finally he spoke up again.
And I believe I'll stay with them to make sure no one does anything untoward.
Yip and Yap exchanged uneasy glances. Yip sighed and nodded.
Yeah, okay, fine, but no spiders. Your friend finds another place for the night.
Matrix looked up at Peter. Peter nodded. I'll be okay.
Keep an eye afore on Bess, would you?" Matrix raised a limb over his head in silent salute, and then scuttled onto Elizabeth's protuberant belly. Peter, meanwhile, swept the pile of cash off the counter and into a large sack. "For safekeeping," he insisted to the suspicious ferrets.
"I'll be counting every penny, come shut up,"
Yip warned.
"And you'll find every penny,"
Peter retorted. Slowly, the remaining crowd dispersed as Peter helped the ferrets close up. Alfred emerged from the kitchen, collecting a round little bowler hat from a knob near the door, and strolled out for the night, cane in hand. Matrix crawled up to Elizabeth's chest as Monster and Saul helped her out of her chair. Her belly wobbled like a sack of jello as her feet hit the floor. Elizabeth clapped a hand over her mouth, rubbing her stomach with the other.
I knew this was a mistake.
Saul chuckled, patting Elizabeth's shoulder.
"Come with me. I know a place you can put your feet up while you digest."
He playfully poked Elizabeth's stomach as he said it.
How about no?
Astrid spoke up. Monster glanced her way, raising an eyebrow in a silent prompt for her to elaborate.
Saul's a bounty hunter.
"So we've heard,"
Monster answered. Astrid set her hands on her hips and cocked her head to one side.
And have you also heard that your friend has a price on her head?
Elizabeth gave Saul a suspicious look. Her gaze turned to a fiery glare as he answered with a sheepish grin.
"Well, Missy, it was the biggest score I've ever seen. You can hardly blame me for trying, can you?"
Elizabeth pursed her lips, slowly nodding.
That does explain a few things. Thank you, Mr. Morden, for coming clean.
Saul nodded, a bit of his former swagger returning.
Now please leave.
Saul sighed and flashed a coy smile.
"For what it's worth, I like you a lot. No hard feelings,
With that, he backed out the doorway and disappeared around a corner. With Saul gone, Astrid looked up at Monster and smiled warmly.
It really is good to see you again. Now let's go. I know the place. We can talk there. And Miss Hartley can take a load off."
Monster stared long and hard at Astrid. She looked different from what he remembered. More seasoned and a little rougher around the edges. Gone was the thick golden braid. Gone the little red sweater. In their place there was a faint scar across her nose. At last he glanced down to Elizabeth.
"Do you trust her?"
A look of intense hurt flashed across Astrid's face as Monster said it. Elizabeth gasped in disbelieving shock.
Of course. She helped us escape the commune, didn't she? And she risked her life in the process.
Astrid nodded.
Others would have killed me if they had found out.
"And yet you remained,"
Monster muttered. Astrid shrugged.
Well, yeah, it was my home.
At last, Monster's expression softened a bit.
"You have my sympathy."
As he gazed into her eyes, he blinked.
"It is also good to see you."
I've missed you.
Astrid whispered.
Excuse me?
Stu piped up.
We gonna leave Elizabeth standing here in her condition or what?
Elizabeth chuckled painfully, rubbing her sides as they groaned against the pressure inside. Astrid gave Stu an irritated look.
Of course not. Come with me.
There won't be any ladders, will there?
Elizabeth asked. Astrid glanced back at Elizabeth and smirked.
Afraid your stomach will get in the way?
Elizabeth blushed as she nodded. Astrid chuckled.
That shouldn't be a problem.
Indeed it was not. Astrid led Elizabeth and the others along the current walkway to the far end of town. Elizabeth struggled to keep her balance as her belly swung from side to side with each step. Stu, who walked alongside her, was very nearly knocked over the railing on one occasion.
So close,
Monster grumbled as he helped the shrew regain his footing. Stu was not amused. He shot a discreet sneer at Monster's back, only for the expression to fade when the large mouse unexpectedly glanced over his shoulder. Monster felt a great swell of pleasure as he watched Stu's face turn red.
I'm so sorry,
Elizabeth exclaimed.
Forget it,
Stu muttered.
He made sure to trail just a bit behind Elizabeth after that. Their destination was a cozy little shack built into the side of the cliff. The front entryway and walkway rested atop the roof of a building underneath. A row of pegs mounted on the front wall offered a place for Elizabeth and Monster to hang their cloaks. Monster gaped in shock as he watched Astrid hang up her things. First the trench coat, and underneath a belt from which hung a handful of sheathed daggers, and then a discreetly hidden longsword she kept slung across her back. Astrid grinned as she caught sight of Monster's expression.
I always wanted to go off and have adventures of my own. I guess I got my wish.
Among other things,
Monster agreed.
Not long after you left, a stranger came through town.
Astrid explained.
He taught us all how to fight, so we could protect ourselves, instead of relying on predators like Jormungandr. I can introduce you tomorrow if you like. He's quite a guy.
Monster grunted, his heart cracking just a bit.
I see. So you two...
Astrid cocked her head to one side, gazing up at Monster as she waited expectantly.
Us two? What?
The crack deepened, bleeding ever so slightly. Then Monster shook his head, his expression growing hard and rock-like.
Oh, never mind. It's nothing.
We aren't together, if that's what you were asking.
Astrid piped up.
His heart belongs to someone else, and so does mine.
Astrid grinned, rubbing Monster's arm and giving it a light kiss.
When I said I missed you, I really meant it.
Monster looked back down at Astrid, his stone heart shattering in a thunderous rock slide. Astrid leapt up Monster's chest and flung her arms around his neck, nuzzling his cheek with a contented smile.
I love...
Stu muttered, glancing up at Elizabeth. Slapping his stomach, he added,
Kinda gets y'all here, don't it?
Don't you mean here?
Elizabeth asked, placing a hand over her heart.
Nah, watching the big dummy get all lovey-dovey makes me sick.
Monster gave Stu a sly grin, and then proceeded to lock lips with Astrid in a passionate kiss. Astrid managed to gasp,
What was that for?
Just for you, Monster answered, winking past Astrid to Stu.
Oh,
Oblivious Astrid blushed.
well, let's all get settled, okay? Elizabeth is probably feeling tired after, well, all that.
Beyond the entryway, the dwelling grew pitch black as it delved into the earth. Astrid lit a small lamp filled with snake oil. The smoke wafted up a narrow chimney of clay and out a hole at the top of a small mound amid the arid landscape. Matrix scurried down Elizabeth's belly and investigated his new surroundings. A pair of doorways led from the initial den into a small kitchen and a bedroom, respectively. The den itself was furnished with a small table, fireplace, and a handful of chairs. A lone rocking chair sat in the far corner, beside a small shelf of books.
Cozy.
Elizabeth remarked.
A little dark, though.
Dark, but secure.
Astrid agreed.
Go ahead and make yourself at him.
She blushed, her eyes resting on Monster.
I mean, home, right through here.
Astrid pointed through a doorway in the right wall. Stu followed Elizabeth as she ducked inside. A moment later, he came flopping back out.
No, Stu.
Elizabeth called from inside.
That wouldn't be proper.
Elizabeth, can I just sit beside y'all?
Elizabeth poked her head out with an amused grin and gave Stu an affectionate hug.
No.
Stu began to protest, only for Elizabeth to cut him off with a shake of her head.
No.
Elizabeth then retreated back into the room. Stu paused a moment, raising his ear to listen for movement. He began to creep towards the doorway when Elizabeth spoke up again, as if reading his mind.
No, Stu.
Stu paused a moment and thought.
What if we had a chaperone?
You mean a chaperone?
Yeah, one of them.
Did you have someone in mind?
Stu grinned, and cupping a hand to his mouth, called into the kitchen.
Hey, bug boy, get over here.
Matrix squeaked, peering out the corner of the doorway.
Yeah, you. I need someone to keep me in line.
Matrix glanced from Stu into the bedroom where Elizabeth reclined. Then he shrugged and nodded. Elizabeth rolled her eyes with a chuckle.
Fine, Stu. You can sit with me, but only for a while.
Stu eagerly lifted Matrix off the ground and kissed the spider where his lips would have been.
Thank you, pal. I owe y'all one.
Matrix, meanwhile, furiously wiped off his fangs with a pair of fuzzy limbs. Ftur! Outside the bedroom, Monster leaned his halberd against a wall and settled down onto the floor.
You know you can sit in the rocking chair, right?
Astrid remarked.
It's much more comfortable.
I was saving it for you.
Monster grunted. Astrid strolled over to Monster's side and rubbed his shoulder.
You don't have to. I can always sit in your lap.
She flashed a flirtatious grin. Monster raised an eyebrow. Inside, his stomach leapt between his lungs. Monster coughed uneasily.
Perhaps I should step out for a breath of air.
I'll come with you.
Astrid exclaimed.
I'd love a good walk in the moonlight.
Monster opened his mouth, but nothing came out. After a time, he chuckled and nodded. He seized up his halberd and emerged into the entryway to don his cloak. Astrid strapped on her weapons and pulled on her trench coat over them.
Up this way,
she announced, leading Monster to a nearby ladder.
The view is wonderful up top.
What Astrid didn't realize, however, was that there was also a fair view from the street below. Not of the moonlit landscape, perhaps, but certainly of the shack where Elizabeth now rested with Stu and Matrix, the very shack that Monster and Astrid had just left. Saul grinned in satisfaction as he watched the two lovebirds disappear over a ledge. He lit up a pipe and emerged from his place in the shadows. He blew a fair-sized smoke ring in the shack's general direction, and rapped his knuckles against a support beam.
This is it, Andre. Our big chance.
The rat groaned in the shadows.
Big Andre doesn't have to eat anymore. I'm still stuffed.
And you did great, partner.
The little girlie is not captured.
And now we deal with that,
Saul answered, darting across the street. Motioning for Big Andre to follow, he added,
All over the wagon.
Big Andre grabbed up a pair of poles, which were attached to a little wooden box mounted on a pair of wheels. The mouse-sized wagon was filled with shreds of cloth and dried grass, a very soft bedding.
Now,
Saul spoke up, once the wagon was in place,
get up to the 3rd level and start digging.
At this, he handed Big Andre a pickaxe and shovel. The rat scratched his head.
Dig?
Yeah, Porky,
Saul answered.
My place had a wooden floor. We could have just weakened the floorboards and been on our way. Astrid's place is built a little further back. We'll need to dig a ramp to slide Miss Hartley's bed out.
Oh!
Big Andre exclaimed, once the plan had been spelled out.
I dig!
You do that, son.
While Big Andre climbed up a series of ladders, Saul set about his business, breaking into an apartment on the 2nd level. The occupant was fast asleep. Saul could hear him snoring in one of the other rooms. Very quietly, Saul drew a knife and began cutting notches into several floorboards. With his work on the floor done, he then set to work on the ceiling. From there, he slipped back out and moved a few floors higher to continue weakening structures in a vertical shaft of rectangular patterns. From there, he slunk down to the stables to retrieve his sun spider. Stu, meanwhile, was having the time of his life.
I could get used to this. I ain't never been on no waterbed before.
You haven't been on one now.
Elizabeth groaned.
That's my stomach. Now get down before you make me throw up.
Stu grinned sheepishly and then slid down to the mattress. Elizabeth rubbed her forehead, leaning her head back against a pillow.
I regret everything. I'll never do it again.
Ain't that what y'all said last time?
I'm talking about letting you in my bedroom.
Stu was silent for a moment.
Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. I'll sit still, I promise.
Elizabeth closed her eyes and heaved a sigh.
Just need to make it to morning. Everything will be better in the morning.
It will?
No, I just tell myself that to get through moments like this.
Stu glanced to Matrix.
That makes sense to you?
Uh-huh. Just then, Elizabeth sat up, gesturing for the others to be silent.
Hush, both of you.
Stu gulped.
Sorry, Elizabeth. Ow!
Do you hear that?
Elizabeth asked. After a moment's thought, she added,
Never mind. Just listen.
Stu cupped a hand to his ear.
Sounds like Morse code. Eat it, Joes.
The floor gave out under the bed, sending the trio screaming in surprise down a ramp and crashing into a large, familiar rat.
No jaw. Eat with Big Andre.
With a laugh, the rat hopped over the foot of the bed, riding it to the bottom with his captives. The impromptu vehicle skidded across the floor until coming to rest near the center of the new room. Big Andre looked at the floor and furrowed his brow.
Something is not right. I'll say,
Stu barked.
like a big dammit interrupting our evening. Yet, floor should.
Big Andre began jumping furiously on the bed.
Go boom.
Elizabeth held her head as a faint burp escaped her throat.
Please don't do that. Just don't.
Big Andre froze, not at Elizabeth's requests, but because his ears picked up the sound of a low groan and the sound of splintering wood.
Uh-oh.
The sounds of screaming resumed as the bed plunged through the floor, crashing into the room below and on through that floor to the next. At the bottom, Saul heard the commotion overhead and immediately knew something had gone terribly wrong.
Andre, you useless,
he shouted. Then he dug in his heels against the sun spider's sides, urging it forward. But too late. The bed crashed through the ceiling, a full length further than Saul had intended, and landed on the Solifuge's abdomen. The beast's eyes bulged, and it collapsed to the ground. Limbs splayed in all directions as it groaned in pain.
Mr. Person hunting person,
Big Andre shouted.
Captives are captured.
Saul glared down at the dazed sun spider, then up at Big Andre.
Yes, and thanks to you, so is our ride.
Captives?
Elizabeth repeated.
Ride,
Stu exclaimed. Huh? Matrix grunted, forelimbs crossing over his chest.
Andre, Saul barked. Help me tip him into the wagon.
Matrix squealed. The spider's quick reflexes allowed him to leap from the bed in time. Elizabeth, however, was too slow. Stu, though an irritant, was also loyal, and insisted on helping Elizabeth to escape. As such, both were sent tumbling over the head of the bed into a pile of dry grass.
I think I'm going to throw up,
Elizabeth moaned, her stomach sloshing under her as she landed. There was a light click, the sound of a gun cocking.
Not in my wagon, sweetheart.
As Elizabeth looked up, she saw an empty void yawning down at her, ringed in steel and smelling of gunpowder. She gulped, forcing back her nausea, and concentrated on the matter at hand.
So, this was your plan all along?
Saul shrugged.
More or less, mostly less.
Glancing over his shoulder, he shouted to Big Andre,
Unhitch the wagon. Our wild friend is no good to us like this. So now, you pull it.
Elizabeth inched away from the distracted bounty hunter, dragging herself towards the rear of the wagon. She yelped in fright, freezing at the sound of a gunshot.
Don't move a muscle, sugar,
Saul warned, cocking his gun for another shot.
You and me, we're going on a little adventure to East Hill.
We ain't going nowhere,
Stu growled, teeth bared and dripping with venomous saliva as he crept towards Saul. A second gunshot rang out. Stu fell to his side with a wail, clutching his bleeding thigh.
Stu!
Elizabeth screamed in horror. Saul blew a faint wisp of smoke from the end of his gun barrel.
That's your last warning shot. Next one kills.
Settling down into a relaxed crouch, he glanced over his shoulder and barked an impatient command.
Well, Andre, are we moving or what?
The commotion had attracted the attention of many observers by now. Gleaming sets of eyes winked out of every window, on every floor, on both sides of the street. Peter leapt from his rest upon hearing the shots, and rushed to the nearest window to look down on the scene. Monster halted his moonlight walk, turning back towards the ravine with a shout, Astrid hot on his heels as he rushed back to investigate. But by then the wagon was in motion. All observers gazed down helplessly as it rolled out the east end of town and into the night. Peter, having been on the second floor of the town's south side, was the first to burst into the street. A small, dark shadow scurried up to greet him, crawling up his arm and onto his shoulder, chattering furiously. "Bess, taken," Peter repeated, once Matrix paused for breath. "Ambushed by Mr. Morton, you say?" "Uh-huh, uh-huh." A low rumble set both their nerves on edge. Peter crept towards the open doors Saul and Big Andre had just vacated. There he found the Sun Spider, dazed and breathless, but unbound and free to prowl about. Once it regained its senses, at least. "It would appear not all went as planned," Peter mused. "Our unsavory friend must have been in a hurry. Rather reckless work, I say." "Uh-huh," Matrix agreed. "This would explain his plans for the Solifuge," Peter added. Monster hit the ground next, sliding down a nearby ladder. Astrid joined him a moment later. He ground to a halt as he spotted the prone Sun Spider, knuckles turning white as he squeezed the shaft of his halberd in fright. Astrid ducked behind Monster, peering around his side.
Is it alive?
"Yes," Peter nodded. "Alive, but dazed." The slow, weary stretching of the beast's jaws confirmed this. "Would someone fetch a chain, please? The Solifuge could be an asset or a liability. I prefer asset, myself." Astrid nodded and darted away, leaving Monster to gaze at his old enemy.
"What happened?"
the huge mouse asked. "It would appear Mr. Morton got what he was after," Peter explained. "Bess has been taken."
"Uh-oh! Uh-oh!"
Matrix chittered. Peter raised an eyebrow. "And Stu, "Psst," Matrix added, tapping one of his many knees. "Shot in the leg, was he?"
"Uh-huh."
Peter looked up at Monster, brow furrowed. "You'll forgive me stating the obvious, but—"
"This is bad,"
Monster agreed, finishing the thought for Peter. "Yes, quite,"
I have your chain,
Astrid announced, as she scampered up to Peter. The rat nodded, taking the chain, and proceeded to rig up a crude harness, similar to a horse's bridle, which he slipped over the Sun Spider's jaws.
What next?
Astrid asked. Monster growled, glancing from the Sun Spider to the far end of town.
"Next, we go on the hunt. We know where they were headed east. So we'll begin there. They were riding in a vehicle, so there should be tracks."
"Unless our mercenary friend thought to go back and cover them," Peter added. Monster shot an irritated glare Peter's way.
"If you have another suggestion, I would greatly appreciate it."
I don't think he will.
Astrid muttered. She wore a look of growing concern on her face. Monster immediately picked up on her tone. He looked down at her, waiting for an explanation. He didn't have to wait long. Astrid looked up at Monster and gulped.
There is only one thing out that way. The locals just call it East Hill. It was the site of the old town, before we moved down here.
Peter exchanged an uneasy glance with Matrix. "Someone's there, then? An old enemy, perhaps?" Astrid nodded.
Matthias. He's turned the hill into a private fortress. Once Elizabeth is inside, there's no way out.
Monster fingered his halberd, his muzzle wrinkling into an angry snarl. He remembered Matthias. There was no forgetting the ancient mouse that nearly killed him.
"Then we'll just have to track down this Saul Morton before he gets there."
"He has a head start," Peter spoke up, glancing to the Sun Spider.
"He's also on foot,"
Monster added, quickly picking up on Peter's train of thought. The huge mouse advanced on the Solifuge. Seizing up the reins trailing from the harness, he gave the beast a good shake. It screeched at the sight of him. Monster snarled back, lowering the blade of his halberd in front of its face. The Sun Spider scrambled to regain its footing. Monster, however, was quicker, leaping up its side and onto its back. He gave a sharp roar and shook the reins again. It fought back, thrashing about. Monster kept his footing, though, and he answered the sun spider's struggles with a harsh pull on the reins, yanking the harness back painfully against the beast's jaws.
He has guns!
Astrid shouted.
Saul will shoot you down the moment he sees you.
Then I won't let him see me,
Monster answered.
Do you even know how to ride one of these things?
Monster shrugged.
I learned to ride the grasshoppers in Edge of the Gorge. I expect this will be similar.
With that, he gave a piercing howl, pulling the reins high and to the right. The sun spider screeched, lurching to the side, and sped off down the street. Astrid wrung her hands, heart pounding, as she watched Monster ride away.
I don't like this,
she stated.
I've seen Saul in action. Monster doesn't stand a chance.
Peter rubbed his chin in thought as he regarded Astrid.
Monster is a fair plan A, but if something should happen, I would prefer a backup, and I don't care to sit on my hands pining away for our friends.
You mean if Saul makes it to East Hill? Or worse?
Astrid's voice trailed off as she pictured Monster bleeding out into the sand, food for ants, crows, and other desert critters.
Indeed,
Peter nodded.
Unfortunately, my skills are more of the mechanical sort.
Astrid bit her lip and checked a pocket inside her trench coat.
I may know someone. He's a personal friend and a good man. Best tracker I've ever seen. He might be willing to give us a reduced rate.
Another mercenary, then, Peter muttered. If he was such a good man, I expect he'd help a personal friend without charge.
Do you want his help or not?
Astrid snapped indignantly. Peter eyed her for a time. At last he nodded.
Take me to him.
Astrid's friend made his home in a run-down apartment at the west end of town, on the north side of the street. There was no door to speak of. Only a ragged cloth hung over the entrance. The windows were both boarded up, having long since been smashed out.
Astrid, lass,
Peter began. She flinched as he touched her shoulder. Peter slowly withdrew his hand.
I beg your pardon, dear.
Astrid shook her head.
No, I'm sorry. After all I've seen, I should be over this great ape business by now.
Peter sensed a but coming. Astrid, however, just shrugged it off. Instead, she gave a sharp knock against the door frame, and drawing the cloth aside, called into the darkness.
Mr. Copper, I've got a job for you.